It is a privilege for me to stand here in the same place before the same union as prime ministers, presidents, and other world notables who have preceded me. I am the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense. If I had to summarize my job in one sentence, it is to ensure that everything our military and our Defense Department do is consistent with U.S. and international law. This includes the prior legal review of every military operation that the Secretary of Defense and the President must approve. My counterpart here in the United Kingdom is Ms. Frances Nash, the legal advisor to the UK Ministry of Defense. Like Ms. Nash, I am a civilian, not a member of the military, consistent with the principle in both our countries of civilian oversight of the military. Unlike Ms. Nash, who was a civil servant and a longtime official of the Ministry of Defense, I am a political appointee. This means I serve at the pleasure of the current U.S. President and have no expectation of serving for any other. Here in the United Kingdom, you refer to July 7, 2005, the day of the terrorist suicide bombings of the London subway, as 7/7. I am a New Yorker and a personal witness to the events of 9/11. I was a private citizen then, and like many others that day, wandered the streets of Manhattan asking, what can I do to help? Over the last 46 months as a public official, I have tried to answer that question. There was a quote from the Brookings Institution in Washington which motivates my own public service. American government was designed to be led by citizens who would step out of private life for a term of office, then return to their communities enriched by service and ready to recruit the next generation of civil servants. The Founding Fathers believed in a democracy led by individuals who would not become so enamored of power and addicted to perquisites that they use government as an instrument of self-aggrandizement. Indeed, it was the British poet Lord Byron who called our first president, George Washington, the Cincinnatus of the West for his decision to surrender his personal power after the American Revolution and retire to his farm at Mount Vernon. As a member of the Obama administration for the last 4 years, I have been privileged to witness many transformational and historic events in the national security of the United States. We ended the combat mission in Iraq. We increased the number of combat forces in Afghanistan and have reversed much of the Taliban's momentum in that country. Challenges remain, but violence is down across the country. We have a timetable for transitioning our efforts in Afghanistan to the Afghans' own security forces, and we are adhering to it. And though we have disagreed with our Afghan partners from time to time, as of this date, we have negotiated and signed understandings with the Afghan government on detention operations, special operations, and an overall strategic partnership, representing major milestones toward the day when the peace and security of that country is fully in the hands of the Afghan people and their government. I was in Afghanistan last week to spend Thanksgiving with our troops there. While there, I encountered a number of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. The British subjects here should be proud of them all. The British hospital I visited at Camp Bastion was first-rate and amazing. And the very good news on that particular day was, at 3 separate hospitals, I saw not a single US or UK casualty, except for a US soldier in need of an appendectomy, a British soldier with a bad knee, and many bored and happy trauma teams standing around with nothing to do. We banned enhanced interrogation techniques consistent with the calls of many in our country, including our own military, that great nations simply do not treat other human beings that way. These controversial practices have been banned, yet we continue to gather valuable intelligence in a manner consistent with our Army Field Manual the Detainee Treatment Act, and international law. We worked with our Congress to enact the Military Commissions Act of 2009, which reformed our system of military commissions to ensure due process and fairness for the accused. Today, our system of military commissions prosecutions of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other alleged organizers of the 9/11 attacks is more credible, sustainable, and transparent. One of our nation's finest military lawyers and a Rhodes Scholar, Brigadier General Mark Martins, is now the chief prosecutor in that system. We worked with our Congress to pass the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act of 2010, such that gay and lesbian members of the U.S. military can now be open and honest about their sexual orientation without fear of being separated for that reason. In the words of one gay service member, "You took a knife out of my back. You have no idea what it is like to serve in silence." And finally, we have, in a manner consistent with our laws and values, taken the fight directly to the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, the result of which is that the core of Al-Qaeda is today degraded, disorganized, and on the run. Osama bin Laden is dead. Many other leaders and terrorist operatives of Al-Qaeda are dead or captured. Those left in Al-Qaeda's core struggle to communicate, issue orders, and recruit. But there is still danger, and there is still much to do. Al-Qaeda's core has been degraded, leaving Al-Qaeda more decentralized, and most terrorist activity now conducted by local franchises, such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, operating in North and West Africa. So therefore, in places like Yemen, and in partnership with that government, we are taking the fight directly to AQAP and continually disrupting its plans to conduct terrorist attacks against U.S. and Yemeni interest. Al-Qaeda has sought to attack the UK on a number of occasions. 2 years ago, Her Majesty's government assessed, quote, "We face a real and pressing threat from international terrorism, particularly that inspired by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Al-Qaeda remains the most potent terrorist threat to the UK," end quote. Our efforts against Al-Qaeda have involved multiple instruments of the U.S. government, including the military, civilian law enforcement, and intelligence services in partnership with the United Kingdom and other nations. It is the U.S. military's efforts against Al-Qaeda and associated forces that has demanded most of my time, generated much public legal commentary, and presented for us what are perhaps the weightiest legal issues in national security. It is the topic that I will spend the balance of my remarks on tonight. The United States government is in an armed conflict against Al-Qaeda and associated forces, to which the laws of armed conflict apply. 1 week after 9/11, our Congress authorized our president to, quote, "use all necessary and appropriate force," end quote, against those nations, organizations, and individuals responsible for 9/11. President Obama, like President Bush before him, as Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces, has acted militarily based on that authorization. In 2006, our Supreme Court also endorsed the view that the United States is in an armed conflict with Al-Qaeda. Therefore, all three branches of the United States government, including the two political branches elected by the people and the judicial branch appointed for life, and therefore not subject to the whims and political pressures of the voters, have endorsed the view that our efforts against Al-Qaeda may properly be viewed as an armed conflict. But for the United States, this is a new kind of war. It is an unconventional war against an unconventional enemy. And given its unconventional nature, President Obama, himself a lawyer and a good one, has insisted that our efforts in pursuit of this unconventional enemy stay firmly rooted in conventional legal principles. For in our efforts to destroy and dismantle al-Qaeda, we cannot dismantle our laws and our values too. The danger of al-Qaeda is well known. It is a terrorist organization determined to commit acts of violence against innocent civilians. The danger of the conflict against al-Qaeda is that it lacks conventional boundaries against an enemy that does not observe the rules of armed conflict, does not wear a uniform, and can resemble a civilian. But we refuse to allow this enemy, with its contemptible tactics, to define the way in which we wage war. Our efforts remain grounded in the rule of law. In this unconventional conflict, therefore, we apply conventional legal principles found in treaties and customary international law. As in armed conflict, we have been clear in defining the enemy and defining our objective against the enemy. We have made clear that we are not at war with an idea, a religion, or a tactic. We are at war with an organized armed group, a group determined to kill innocent civilians. We have publicly stated that our enemy consists of those persons who are part of the Taliban, al-Qaeda, or associated forces, a declaration that has been embraced by 2 U.S. presidents, accepted by our courts, and affirmed by our Congress. We have publicly defined an associated force as having 2 characteristics: an organized armed group that has entered the fight alongside al-Qaeda and is a co-belligerent with al-Qaeda in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners. Our enemy does not include anyone solely in the category of activist, journalist, or propagandist. Nor does our enemy in this armed conflict include a, quote, lone wolf, end quote, who, inspired by al-Qaeda's ideology, self-radicalizes in the basement of his own home without ever actually becoming part of al-Qaeda. Such persons are dangerous, but are a matter for civilian law enforcement, not the military, because they are not part of the enemy force. And we have publicly stated that our goal in this conflict is to disrupt, dismantle, and ensure a lasting defeat of al-Qaeda and violent extremist affiliates. Some legal scholars and commentators in our country brand the detention by the military of members of al-Qaeda as, quote, indefinite detention without charges. Some refer to targeted lethal force against known individual members of al-Qaeda as, quote, extrajudicial killing, end quote. Viewed within the context of law enforcement or criminal justice, where no person is sentenced to death or prison without an indictment, an arraignment, and a trial before an impartial judge or jury, those characterizations might be understandable. Viewed within the context of conventional armed conflict, as they should be, capture, detention, and lethal force are traditional practices as old as armies. Capture and detention by the military are part and parcel of armed conflict. We employ weapons of war against al-Qaeda, but in a manner consistent with the law of war. We employ lethal force, but in a manner consistent with the law of war principles of proportionality, necessity, and distinction. We detain those who are part of al-Qaeda, but in a manner consistent with Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions and all other applicable law. But now that efforts by the U.S. military against al-Qaeda are in their 12th year, we must also ask ourselves, how will this conflict end? It is an unconventional conflict against an unconventional enemy, and will not end in conventional terms. Conventional conflicts in history tend to have conventional endings. 200 years ago, our 2 nations fought the War of 1812. The United States lost many battles. Washington, D.C. was captured, and the White House was set ablaze. But by the winter of 1814, British and American forces had strengthened their forts and fleets and assumed that fighting would resume between them in the spring. But the war ended when British and American diplomats in Belgium came to a peace agreement on December 24, 1814. Diplomats from both sides then joined together in a Christmas celebration at Ghent Cathedral. Less than 8 weeks later, The U.S. Senate provided advice and consent to that peace treaty, for which the United States legally and formally terminated the conflict. In the American Civil War, the Battle of Appomattox was the final engagement of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's great army of Northern Virginia, and one of the last battles of that war. After 4 years of war, General Lee recognized that it would be useless and therefore cruel to provoke the further effusion of blood. 3 days later, the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered. Lee's army then marched to the field in front of Appomattox Courthouse, and division by division deployed into lines, stacked their arms, folded their colors, and walked home empty-handed. The last day of the First World War was November 11th, 1918, when an armistice was signed at 5 a.m. in a carriage house in France, and a ceasefire took effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The Second World War was concluded in the Pacific Theater in August 1945, with a ceremony that took place on the deck of the USS Missouri. During the Gulf War of 1991, 1 week after Saddam Hussein's forces set fire to oil wells as they were driven out of Kuwait, U.S. General Schwarzkopf sat down with Iraqi military leaders under a tent in a stretch of the occupied Iraqi desert, a few miles from the Kuwaiti border. General Schwarzkopf wanted to keep discussions simple. He told his advisors, "I just want to get my soldiers home as fast as possible. I want no ceremonies, no handshakes." In the space of 2 hours, they had negotiated the terms of a permanent ceasefire to end the First Gulf War. We cannot and should not expect Al-Qaeda and its associated forces to all surrender, all lay down their weapons in an open field, or to sign a peace treaty with us. They are terrorist organizations, nor can we capture or kill every last terrorist who claims an affiliation with Al-Qaeda. I am aware of studies that suggest that many terrorist organizations eventually denounce terrorism and violence and seek to address their grievances through some form of reconciliation or participation in a political process. Al-Qaeda is not in that category. Al-Qaeda's radical and absurd goals have included global domination through a violent Islamic caliphate, terrorizing the United States and other Western nations from retreating from the world stage, and the destruction of Israel. There is no compromise or political bargain that can be struck with those who pursue such aims. In the current conflict with Al-Qaeda, I can offer no prediction about when this conflict will end, or whether we are, as Winston Churchill once described it, near the, quote, beginning of the end, end quote. I do believe that on the present course, there will come a tipping point at which so many of the leaders and operatives of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates have been killed or captured, and the group is no longer able to attempt or launch a strategic attack against the United States, such that Al-Qaeda as we know it, the organization that our Congress authorized the military to pursue in 2001, has been effectively destroyed. At that point, we must be able to say to ourselves that our efforts should no longer be considered a, quote, armed conflict against Al-Qaeda and its associated forces. Rather, a counterterrorism effort against individuals who are the scattered remnants of Al-Qaeda or are parts of groups unaffiliated with Al-Qaeda, for which the law enforcement and intelligence resources of our government are principally responsible, in cooperation with the international community, with our military assets available in reserve to address continuing and imminent terrorist threats. At that point, we will also need to face the question of what to do with any members of Al-Qaeda who still remain in U.S. military detention without a criminal conviction and sentence. In general, the military's authority to detain ends with the, quote, cessation of active hostilities, end quote. For this particular conflict, all I can say today is that we should look to conventional legal principles to supply the answer, and that both our nations faced similar challenging questions after the cessation of hostilities in World War II, and our governments delayed the release of some Nazi German prisoners of war. For now, we must continue our efforts to disrupt, dismantle, and ensure a lasting defeat of al-Qaeda. Though severely degraded, al-Qaeda remains a threat to the citizens of the United States, the United Kingdom, and other nations. We must disrupt al-Qaeda's terrorist attack planning before it gets anywhere near our homeland or our citizens. We must counter al-Qaeda in the places where it seeks to establish safe haven and prevent it from reconstituting in others. To do this, we must utilize every national security element of our government and work closely with our friends and allies like the United Kingdom and others. Finally, it was a warfighting four-star general who reminded me, as I previewed these remarks for him, that none of this will ever be possible if we fail to understand and address what attracts a young man to an organization like al-Qaeda. In the first place, al-Qaeda claims to represent the interest of all Muslims. By word and deed, we must stand with the millions of people within the Muslim world who reject al-Qaeda as a marginalized, extreme, and violent organization that does not represent the Muslim values of peace and brotherhood. For if al-Qaeda can recruit new terrorists to its cause faster than we can capture or kill them, we fight an endless, hopeless battle that only perpetuates a downward spiral of hate, recrimination, violence, and fear. War must be regarded as a finite, extraordinary, and unnatural state of affairs. War permits one man, if he is a privileged belligerent, consistent with the laws of war, to kill another. War violates the natural order of things, in which children bury their parents. In war, parents bury their children. In its 12th year, we must not accept the current conflict and all that it entails as the, quote, new normal, end quote. Peace must be regarded as the norm toward which the human race continually strives. Right here at Oxford, you have the excellent work of the Changing Character of War program, leading scholars committed to the study of war, who have observed that analyzing war in terms of a continuum of armed conflict, where military force is used at various points without a distinct break between war and peace, is counterproductive. Such an approach, they argue, results in an erosion of any demarcation between war and peace, the very effect of which is to create uncertainty about how we define war itself. I did not go to Oxford, nor am I a Rhodes Scholar. I am a graduate of a small, all-male, historically black college in the southern part of the United States, Morehouse College. The guiding light for every Morehouse man is our most famous alumnus, Martin Luther King, who preached the inherent insanity of all wars. I am therefore a student and disciple of Dr. King, though I became an imperfect one the first time I gave legal approval for the use of military force. I accepted this conundrum when I took this job, but I still carry with me the words from Dr. King. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adhering deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing more wars, must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate the invitation and the honor of being invited here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.